Hello everybody, my name is Luke Mar and this is HauteLeMode, and today on HauteLeMode we are going to be breaking down the history of Karl Lagerfeld. Karl Lagerfeld was an icon, and an icon is defined as, quote, a person or thing widely admired, especially for having great influence or significance in a particular sphere. And whether you like Karl Lagerfeld or not, it is undeniable that he held great influence and significance in the particular sphere that is luxury fashion. And seeing as the Metropolitan Museum of Art's Costume Institute has announced that the 2023 exhibition will be titled Karl Lagerfeld, A Line of Beauty, I think we should look at a timeline of Lagerfeld's work and influence both in the fashion industry and the other industries he might have touched along the way, as well as his influence on pop culture, which obviously stirred up quite a bit of controversy and helped to further fuel his celebrity. Before we begin discussing Karl Lagerfeld's life, let's do some quick MET Gala housekeeping. Firstly, the MET Gala will be held on Monday, May 1st, 2023, which is keeping in with its first Monday in May traditional date. And the Karl Lagerfeld, A Line of Beauty exhibit will open to the public starting on May 5th. In the Met's Tisch Gallery, and will close out on July 16th, 2023. The gala will be hosted by Anna Wintour, editor-in-chief of Vogue, of course, with this year's guest co-hosts including Michaela Coel, Roger Federer, Dua Lipa, and Penelope Cruz, who actually walked in Lagerfeld's last show for Chanel. And as for the theme of the actual Met Gala, which should not be confused with the theme for the actual exhibit, it has been set as in honor of Karl, and seems to be a way for attendees to pay tribute and homage to the late Karl Lagerfeld and his 60-plus year career in the fashion industry. Do I expect Katy Perry to show up as a Diet Coke can? Probably. Now, attendees will be able to pull inspiration from a range of fashion brands like Chanel, Fendi, Balmain, Patou, Chloé, as well as his own brand Karl Lagerfeld, where Karl Lagerfeld worked over his career. And between Chanel, Chloé, and Fendi alone, there are decades worth of fashion collections to pursue for reference. So now that we've cleared that up, let's get into Karl Lagerfeld's history so we can actually discuss what we can expect to see on the Met steps and the actual exhibit as well. Karl Otto Lagerfeld was born on September 10th, 1933, although for years his actual birthday was shrouded in mystery, which Lagerfeld alleged was due to his mother changing his birth year for her own convenience. It was more likely about his own penchant for storytelling and certain associations. Karl was born in Hamburg, Germany, the second largest city in the country, and was born to Otto and Elisabeth Lagerfeld. Otto Lagerfeld was an entrepreneur who gained an upper-middle-class status through his work as an importer of evaporated milk from the United States. And later, he would form a company named Gluckskli, which was a German version that still exists today. His mother Elizabeth tended to the home and was as exacting as many German mothers were. Karl's birth year was a rather significant time, as in 1933 the Nazi Party took power in Germany, with swift political movements and totalitarian authority. Adolf Hitler latched onto power and began what would be one of the worst human genocides that the world had ever seen. It was a tumultuous time and one that Karl was, quote, ashamed of, as he said in the 1990s to publisher friend Gerhard Steidl. Karl often said that his birthday was September 10th, 1938, which many believe was an attempt to shave off some years of his life due to vanity. But Steidl would go on to say Karl told him, quote, I was ashamed that I was born in the year when Hitler started his project of killing the Jewish population of Germany, and I did not want to be connected to that year. But Karl's early years set him aside from the horrors that were going on in Nazi Germany. His earliest years were in the wealthy area of Blankenese, Hamburg, by the river and boats, but in 1935, Otto moved the family out of the city to the countryside, as he foresaw what war could do to the country. The family estate, titled Bissenmoor, was a nice country home with a good amount of land that Otto would turn into a farm, with lots of cows, which Karl didn't seem to enjoy. And this is because as Karl grew into a young boy, he was vastly different than the other boys in his little town. His behavior to them was odd. His manner of dress to them was odd. His attitude to them was odd. I mean, he was, well, a little gay boy with an exacting personality living in the 1930s Nazi Germany in a nowheresville town. And due to his father's constant work travels, he remained at home with his mother Elizabeth most of the time. She was an intellectual who read voraciously and was a polyglot who invoked a lot into the young Karl, but she also could be cruel. She didn't like to listen to children, quote, babble, and she was quick to pick out flaws flaws about Karl's physical being, telling him he should have a curtain hanging in front of his nose, or that his mahogany-colored hair reminded her of an old dresser. As for Karl's style, even as a child, he was, well, fashionable, but just not for bad Bramstead, which is the town that he grew up in. He wore Tyrolean suits with big bow ties, while other boys wore shorts and homemade sweaters, which obviously would create a clear distinction. The other boys liked to run and jump and climb, and Karl liked to read books from his parents' abundant collection and draw like the cartoonists and illustrators that excited him. And he avoided filth at all costs. And the biggest difference, especially during the Third Reich, was Karl's long black ponytailed hair, which was in direct contrast from the crew-cut hairstyles of the Hitler Youth, which was socially regular at the time. At one point, a teacher even suggested to his mother Elizabeth that Karl should cut his hair to match the other boys. And Elizabeth, according to Karl at the very least, grabbed the teacher by the tie and asked him, "What are you, still a Nazi?" But the strangest thing about Karl's assertion here is that German journalist Alphonse Kaiser discovered that Elizabeth was in fact a member of the Nazi Party alongside her husband Otto. While it was common during this age of German history to join the Nazi Party due to agreeing with the ideas of racial purity or for protecting one's self-interests in a range of sectors, whether it's safety or business or a bit of both, it's still a very stark idea for Karl Lagerfeld to be the son of Nazis. Now, for the record, Karl was never in the Hitler Youth, as the age to sign up for it was 14, and World War II was over by the time that he was 12, although Kaiser did find a photograph of the Lagerfelds raising the Nazi flag at their home of Bissenmoor, with the 4-year-old Karl Lagerfeld looking on at it. So it's undeniable that Karl Lagerfeld was raised by Nazis during the Third Reich, surrounded by a horrific war and a Holocaust that was even worse, that killed millions. And now, while it's easy to find fault with Karl on many things, I personally can't condemn him for the actions of his parents and his country. But also, I don't think that it's something that should be hidden away or never discussed. Ignorance and secrecy is not the answer to those tragedies. We must look at them in the face and acknowledge their presence always. When the war was over, the Lagerfelds weren't particularly affected by it all that much. As Karl moved out of his childhood and into his teens, he increasingly became inspired by his parents' still extensive library, and became dazzled by the 17th and 18th century French aristocracy, specifically the correspondences of one Princess Palatine, a German-born aristocrat that married the widowed brother of Louis XIV. She observed French court with a biting wit that Karl was enthralled by, and the beauty and pomp of court that she described only further nursed Karl's desire to be in the City of Lights, Paris. But alas, his mother's desire to leave the countryside and move back to Hamburg required a new house for the Lagerfelds, which had to be built. So in the meantime, they stayed at the Hotel Esplanade, which is where in 1949, Christian Dior, the late great couturier and inventor of the new look, staged a fashion show as part of a fundraiser to help Hamburg after the war. The 16-year-old Karl Lagerfeld attended the showing with his mother, and between the models, the aura, and the clothing, including the famous new look, which young Karl from then on always admired, and between this and his already constant musings about the historical significance of France's past, the kraut that broke the schnitzel's back, he wanted to move to Paris. But Karl was still stuck in Hamburg, preparing for his Parisian future by studying French and becoming fluent, as well as focusing on his illustrations, which at the time were becoming obviously clothing-centric. So much so that his mother showed his work to the director of art at the University of Hamburg, who did go on to confirm that he should be a costume designer rather than an artist. And so when he turned 19, with the support from Otto and Elizabeth, he was shipped off to Paris to pursue his dreams. But his parents did have expectations of him. He said later in his life that they told him, quote, "Do what you want, but it has to be a success." He arrived at the end of August in 1952 and moved to the Latin Quarter, or the 5th arrondissement, where Parisian cultural institutions like the Sorbonne, Café de Flore, and Le Deux Margots stood and still stand. Karl's arrival in Paris was both a wonderful time to be young and obsessed with fashion due to the titans that ruled over the city, like Christian Dior and Jacques and Cristobal Balenciaga. But it was also tough to be a German, as the French, and especially the Parisians, were still adjusting to life after the Nazi occupation of France and the Vichy regime, which was cruel and tried its hardest to suck the life out of the city and its people. At one point, the Nazis even tried to export haute couture to Berlin, but luckily failed in that endeavor. But nonetheless, Parisians were rightfully aggressive to Germany and its citizens, so much so that they only referred to them as Krauts. Karl did everything he could to hide his German root, from modifying his appearance to look less Germanic and more, well, anything else, and making sure that his accent appeared perfectly French and didn't have any sort of Germanic drawl. A year after Karl arrived in Paris, he began to take fashion illustration classes at the Cours Norero, run by André Norero Petitjean, who would stay as a confidant to Lagerfeld throughout his career and life. Petitjean was the daughter of two artists and worked as an illustrator for Nicole Groult, who was the younger sister of the designer Paul Poiret. Norero realized that Karl was special and nurtured his talent, often bringing him to haute couture showings that she attended. And speaking of fashion shows, Karl's mother's friend actually got him a ticket to attend Coco Chanel's famous comeback show in 1954. Karl attended, but didn't know that nearly 30 years later, he would be debuting his own Chanel comeback show. But more on that later. Between seeing these fashion shows and the nourishment of Madame Petitjean, two sketches of the time showcased Karl's growing strength in understanding clothing. The Art of Accommodating Leftover Fur from 1954 showcases women sitting in a crowded restaurant wearing the newest fashions, nipped waists, high collars, trims in fur and tassels, and captures the atmosphere of the time. Notably, some of the subjects' faces are not totally complete, probably as a measure to focus on the clothing. What is clear here is Karl's growing finesse as an illustrator. And in spring hats, we can see again gorgeous women, all wearing the newest chapeaus, staring in a mirror at themselves. Karl's attention to detail in both is striking, from creating textures like black Astrakhan fur in leftover fur that juxtaposes itself against a yellow dress, or dynamic pink pleats on a hat in spring hat. Karl's sketches would soon not only exist on paper, though, as the second annual International Wool Secretariat, or later known as the Woolmark Prize, requested that aspiring designers sketch a full look. If it was a winning style, it would be produced by a real haute couturier. This excited Karl, and so he created a few sketches and sent them off, and after a while heard back that he had won first prize in the coat category. His coat was called Longchamp after the famous racetrack in the Bois de Boulogne, and was a knee-length coat with a plunging neckline exclusively in the back, which was uncommon for the time. Two other designers also won prizes. One was Colette Bracci, and the other one was Yves Saint Laurent, but more on this later. Karl's look, as promised, was produced by an haute couturier, the notable Pierre Balmain, a colleague of Christian Dior, who had started his own maison just a few years before Dior, and originally wanted to go into partnership with Dior on a maison together. Now, at the ceremony for the prize, Maria Therese, a Pierre Balmain house model, looked glorious in the coat, and Karl began to network, speaking with Balmain himself, who would go on to offer him a job as a designer at the Maison. And so in January of 1955, young Karl arrived at Pierre Balmain on the right bank of Paris. When he entered into the hallowed haute couture halls, he didn't like it so much. While he'd already been rather unimpressed working at Balmain because it was no Dior, the aura inside his new job was somber and sad, which didn't help. The reason that Karl was sullen about Balmain is while the brand at that point was known for its haute couture and had a business that kept 600 employees afloat, the simple dress and jacket combinations and the pleated gowns never really created a memorable sensation, not just for Karl, but for most people. Unlike Dior, who revolutionized all of fashion, Balmain made much less of a ruckus, and he wasn't really generally exciting, and when you're 20 and working in fashion, it's incredibly important to your image and ego for the brand to be exciting. Listen, I'm going to tell you that as somebody that worked in fashion, like if it wasn't good, it's like, you feel like shit. Now, Karl started as a design assistant, which meant that he was on the bottom rung of the fashion ladder, and his job was rather grueling as far as fashion design jobs go. Karl and the other assistants were required to sketch each each look from the collection down to the details like embroidery or prints, which would then be compiled into a portfolio, and then they would be sent off to clients so they could pick what they like. And if Balmain showed 150 looks a season, which happened often, that was a whole lot of looks to be sketching individually by hand. There was no printer. There was no scanning. While Karl did work with other designers, his voracious appetite for work led him to eventually start to do theirs, which wasn't for the benefit of them, but rather because once they left the Maison for the day, it made Karl look like he was a very diligent and dedicated young employee, and eventually, the others began to fall away, leaving him in charge. Now, Karl had an early run-in with dressing celebrities while at Balmain as well, as Jacques, the famous actress, once wore one of the hats that he had actually designed with Balmain. And while the photo is lost to a private collection, the trauma, you don't know how long I looked on Google Images for it, having one of the most famous women in the world at that point wear your hat must have made Karl feel special. In March of 1955, the other winner of the International Wool Secretariat, Yves Saint Laurent, landed a job at Dior thanks to family connections. While some say that Karl and Yves reconnected after the IWS at school, I can't find any actual record of this, so I can't say that it's necessarily true. And I haven't found a way that they actually reconnected in those early years at all in Paris. But nonetheless, they did reconnect and began to party together along with Anne-Marie Munoz, who would later become the head of Yves Saint Laurent's haute couture atelier, and Victoire, a Dior house model who Karl and Yves would vie for the platonic affections of. Often they would speed around Paris to all the clubs and parties in the convertible Volkswagen that Karl's father had actually bought for him. And while the gang was having fun, Karl was contemplating his future, and it didn't seem to include staying at Balmain. While working for Balmain's Florilège line was well received, and was his first dip into what would eventually become ready-to-wear or prêt-à-porter, working at the brand was not all it was cracked up to be. The low pay, the mean-spirited nature, and the, quote, big social complexes of fashion people helped to push him to look at other opportunities. And when Yves Saint Laurent was announced to the world as Christian Dior's successor in 1957, that might have been the straw that broke the camel's back. And Karl had to leave. In 1958, Karl began as the creative director of Jean Patou, an haute couture maison that had existed since 1914 and was known in the 1920s as a competitor of Chanel, who had kept up with Coco as the post-World War I energy meant an increase in clients. Patou became known for his sportswear attire, not the leggings or sweatshirts we think of sportswear as today, but rather smart but loose-fitting looks that allowed women during the 1920s to play sports, work careers, and just be a lot more agile than they had been pre-war. Jean Patou's collections were noted as, quote, a classic somber collection with nothing outrageous. And some Patou house codes were furs worn in both winter and summer, wool day dresses that were specifically woven for Patou, contrasting fabrics and evening wear ensembles that reference both traditional menswear and women's wear textiles, and vibrant and new colors with poetic and quirky names. But Jean Patou himself had died in 1936, and the brand was run by his sister and his muse Madeleine and her husband Raymond Barbas, with lots of designers trying to fill the role after that. So when Karl started leading the house at the tender age of 25, it was a bit of a career jump for him. He was now in charge of an haute couture house of his own and showed his collection on the same schedule as the greats like Chanel, Dior, and Balenciaga. A profile from a Vogue pattern book says that Karl's first collection, Fall-Winter 1958, was completed in only 3 weeks and was later dubbed the, quote, K line. Photos from the collection show wool skirt suits with very large buttons and scarves tucked under the collar, and a silk shawl coat with arm slits donning the runway. The collection then would have finished off with the white wedding finale look, whose large veil with 3D faux flowers at the top covered a white short caped gown. Now, Carrie Donovan in the New York Times reported that, quote, the press booed Lagerfeld's collection for Patou, which might mean it didn't land as smoothly as Karl would have wanted. Also, like, imagine today the girls booing at a fashion show? Jeez. And this would have been rather unlike Yves Saint Laurent's debut for Dior, which likened him to a genius and the little prince of fashion. Luckily, Karl's second collection, spring 1959, was better received, and Donovan noted that the collection had, quote, an understated chic elegance, and just plain class. Donovan also noted that, quote, Karl has rounded the shoulder line, added, quote, an exaggerated shoulder pleats over the hip line, making them gently rounder, and showing evening clothes that were, quote, short and full-skirted, with tantalizing decolletes and skin-tight bodices. The showing got a wild round of applause for Karl and seemed to place him in a better standing amongst the fashion crowd. During Karl's tenure at Patou, not only did he get to flex his creative muscles for the public, but he also got to experience the expertise and craftsmanship that haute couture requires. Many of the seamstresses at Patou were of a certain age, which meant that they had been around during the 1920s and the 1930s, which was a renaissance in haute couture. One in particular, Madame Alphonsine, understood complex flow techniques like draping and the bias cut, and taught them to Karl. And he wasn't as busy there. He really had a lot of time to learn about the actual craft and the requirements of haute couture, from fabrics to finishings. And here, Karl was also put to the test when it came to understanding garment construction, as his lack of sewing skills meant that his sketches had to be precise and comprehensive for the actual seamstresses and their bosses, the premiers of the ateliers. While it's great to be able to sketch, a designer must have the technical and constructive background to rectify problems when the garment comes to life. And for Karl, if he couldn't, the premiers, and by proxy the seamstresses, would lose respect for him. It would be like an unprepared schoolboy trying to dictate nonsense to the principal and teachers. But luckily, Karl was able to learn how to be precise in his sketches so that these issues wouldn't arise. And it meant that gorgeous garments could be constructed in his name. One particularly stunning style was a black silk gown with a large bustle skirt whose bodice created a fan effect by incorporating strips of fabric in a five-sided bow configuration, which would go on to be worn by the bona fide French star Catherine Deneuve, who looked absolutely radiant in it and only helped to propel Karl's name and notoriety. Another thing that Karl might not have learned at Patou, but certainly had to have been aware of, was the brand's history of radical diversification of product. While Patou was an haute couture house at the time, its shining star wasn't really haute couture, but rather a simply named perfume called Joy. It was invented in 1929 as a response to the Great Depression, and Joy kept Patou afloat when economic times were difficult during the 1930s. And it just became a bestseller, especially in America, where a lot of Patou's customers were. Patou also had quite a few other perfumes that were global successes and made some considerable profits in other areas like sporting styles, in knitwear, bathing suits, and licensing any number of those styles to American department stores to make en masse. Patou was still running its perfume department while Karl was there, and while he might not have had anything to do with production or scent cultivation, he certainly was surrounded by a multifaceted brand. But after working at Patou for 5 years, Karl's Swan collection came in the form of spring 1963. I haven't been able to find much on the collection, to be fair. The photos I have seen showcase a collection with large button coat dresses or intricately embroidered bustiers on long gowns. But regardless of Karl's last collection, his time at Patou was over, and unlike his frenemy Yves Saint Laurent, it wasn't a firing, rather it was an amicable moving on. Now in the 1960s, everything in fashion changed. No longer was the bourgeois haute couture king, as it was about to be eclipsed by none other than its less ostentatious and expensive kid brother, ready-to-wear. And Karl Lagerfeld, ever the observer of the cultural zeitgeist, saw this. He began to work freelance, picking up contract jobs from a host of different clothing and accessory making outlets like Mario Valentino, Repetto, and the French supermarket chain Monoprix, designing everything from shoes to dresses. His friend Anne-Marie Munoz described him as a, quote, styliste, which during that time was a designer that worked for a brand that wasn't their own, whether that was as a creative director or as a designer specifically creating for manufacturers and factories. It wasn't nearly as glamorous as being at an haute couture house, but it allowed the stylist freedom as well as opportunities to design outside the restrictive terms of the big houses. But while Karl was working with these manufacturing brands, he started to be picked up by smaller, less well-known fashion brands, one being Chloé. based in Paris, and the other being Fendi, based in Rome. In 1964, Karl joined the French pret-a-porter, in English ready-to-wear, studio of Chloé, which had been founded by Gaby Ayon. Gaby Ayon was born in Alexandria, Egypt, to a cigarette magnate father and fashion-loving mother, and moved to Paris in 1945 with her art gallerist husband. She grew tired of living off her husband's money, and in 1952 she decided to open one of, if not the first luxury ready-to-wear fashion brands. She said that the gap between the extreme luxury of haute couture and the bleak simplicity of very simple ready-to-wear that didn't care for fabric composition or exciting design led her to want to create something she and her artist friends could actually wear. She hired seamstresses from the recently closed haute couture maison Lucien Lelong and began to focus on fabric, specifically cotton poplin, and the styles of the sporting clubs of Alexandria in the 1930s and 1940s. Ayon created 6 dresses for her first collection, and they were all cotton dresses of the same cut, but in different colors. Unfortunately, there are no photos though. And from there, Chloé more or less seemed to create well-made and good quality, ready-to-wear that fit in with the youthful fashion zeitgeist of the time. The styles followed the silhouettes of the late 1950s, but was much less restrictive than the corseted clothes of Christian Dior or Jacques. And once the 1960s crept in, dresses got boxier and skirt suits slimmed down. And by 1964, Ayon had amassed a group of cool designers that ran her studio and worked with her to design the collections. And her newest addition would be a young Karl. His first collection at the brand was Autumn-Winter 1964, and the collection was said to have looked at the glamour of the 1930s, and had lots of lace details and silk-sheathed dresses. Considering there were 4 other designers working besides Karl, he really only had a minor role at the company this early on, and Ayon only had him design 2 looks per season for the first year or 2, so we can't really tell what is actually his. But eventually, as time went on, many of the other designers left, and he and Graziella Fontana were the only 2 working. Ayon understood that Karl was talented, and like her, he was a devourer of all things culture, so his ideas were boundless and pulled from everywhere, which led her to rely on him more and more. And as time progressed, Karl slowly expanded on the Chloé universe, building out some of its most iconic staples. In the spring 1966 collection, Karl introduced his hand-painted silk dresses, which showcased bright and vibrant designs that captured the artistic spirit of the 1960s. And in the same collection, Karl's blouses made serious headway. They were described as the, quote, most flattering evening blouses, marvelously elegant with ruffles, bows, and pleats. These blouses were not only a creative hit that began to capture the bohemian aura that would eventually envelop the 1970s as a whole, but they also were a commercial smash, which proved that Lagerfeld had what it took to charm both critics and customers. Karl learned quite a lot about trimming down his grand aesthetic to fit the criteria of ready-to-wear from Gaby, who understood that ready-to-wear must be of the moment and, quote, fresh as a salad. Without this, it would lose its momentum, and Chloé, unlike the haute couture houses, didn't have perfumes and licensing agreements to keep it afloat if a collection didn't sell. Karl's Chloé through the 1960s would continue to capture the aura of the decade and pave the way for the one that followed it. But in 1965, Karl, through a connection of a friend, would start the longer collaborative project of his career. And it wouldn't even be in Paris. Fendi was founded in 1925 by Edoardo and Adele Fendi, who began the brand as a fur and leather atelier, partly because Adele had already been working as a fur specialist at another atelier. Their brand took off with the aristocracy of Rome, where it all began, and the brand would slowly move to creating more and more product lines as time went on. In 1946, Edoardo passed away, and the 5 daughters of his and Adele's stepped up to become more involved in the company's management. The 5 daughters, Paola, Alda, Franca, Carla, and Anna, by the 1960s obviously saw that fashion was changing, and so they asked a PR advisor named Franco Salvarelli to find a designer willing to make furs that were, quote, a bit different. Karl, ever the stylist, agreed to meet the sisters, but he did know that Fendi prior to his arrival was, quote, known in Rome for expensive and beautiful furs, very rich, bourgeois, but heavy. Essentially, fur during this era was a way for a woman to show she had money and status. That she could afford to wear one was a luxury, but often it was meant to last years, sometimes almost decades. So when Karl agreed to sign with the Fendi sisters, he was tasked with creating a small collection that would be, quote, fashion, and quote, fun mixed together. And to a degree, that request was the antithesis of what fur up to that point had symbolized. But Karl, ever the one to take on a challenge, began to sketch in front of them. His pen moved quickly and sketched out a design that showcased two Fs interlocking. It was simple, it was daring, it represented Fendi, fun, fashion, all at once, and it would go on to become the monogram of the brand. His first collection for Fendi was in 1966, but it had already begun to alter the vision of fur most of the world had. This early collection depicts models wearing tunic pantsuits with leather trims, a full mink mini coat, and a fur handbag, which for the time was quite radical because it just wasn't common. And there was even, allegedly, a full white mink style for brides who cared for such things. Over time, Karl would begin to implant his signature at the brand, such as full-length fur coats that looked almost gown-like, geometric motifs that covered everything from coats to shawls, possibly in a nod to the lines and art of the Art Deco movement, which by then Karl was more than obsessed with, and traditional riding gear with jodhpurs and snug mink jackets for the whole family. These early years at Fendi also showcased Karl's ability to sketch not just clothing, but accessories as well. While the Fendis wanted their new fur line to sell, they more than likely also wanted Karl to create fun and whimsical items to go along with his fashions. And hence we see a geometric reticule bag inspired by the 1920s, and shoes galore from riding-inspired boots to smart brogues. And while Karl designed for this plethora of brands simultaneously, he was still able to have a personal life. While in Paris in 1968, he met two very important Americans from New York, Antonio Lopez and Juan Ramos, who would become his friends for much of the 1970s and would help to create his first clique. Lopez was a fashion illustrator, published in major magazines like Elle as well as Women's Wear Daily, while Ramos was an art director who was Lopez's working partner in both love and career. Karl quickly scooped up the two after they were on assignment at a Chloé show, as he found their American spirit and vigor exciting, and Karl also always loved a shiny new toy. Then Karl breezily moved into the 1970s, but it was both a great but tough decade for him. In some regards, it's when Karl really started to become a, quote, personality in fashion that commanded respect and built up his own persona. But he was also in a constant competition with his old friend Yves Saint Laurent in both a career and personal sense. In reality, the 1970s for Karl was a decade of biding his time, and subtly he implanted himself under some of the fashion and cultural elites' noses in ways that would pay off for him later. But for now, Saint Laurent was becoming a major hit in the fashion world. Between the Mondrian dresses, the Claude Lelin collaboration, and Le Smoking Suit, all of the 1960s, Yves was the Prince of Paris, which more than likely annoyed Karl. And slowly but surely their friendship began to fade in the 1970s. Between Yves' business partner Pierre Berger's attitude, the insular friend group that Yves had called Le Clan, and his burgeoning stardom, Yves just didn't have the time for Karl like he did in the 1950s and 1960s. And while Karl did build out his own friend group with Lopez and Ramos and their friends like the cool young American models such as Pat Cleveland, Donna Jordan, Jessica Lange, Jerry Hall, and Grace Jones, who all partied in the same places like the famous Parisian club Le Sept and the Palace, the two just never rekindled their once fun student years. But alas, the two, while gradually drifting, did have some of the same friends. They both were friendly with Andy Warhol and members of his factory, while Andy and his business partner Fred Hughes began to hear about Karl and wanted to interact with him, and so they invited him to appear in their 1973 film titled L'Amour. The film is essentially a very strange love triangle involving Americans living in Paris, and Karl played a very rich husband, even makes out with his on-screen wife in a rather long and passionate make-out scene. I personally would not recommend watching it because I literally cannot understand anything that is going on. Here's the make-out scene for those interested. Listen, if I had to watch it, you all have to as well. We're suffering as a group here. Now, the film did help Karl, though, as it introduced him to Pablo Picasso's daughter, Paloma, who would go on to be a tether between his and Yves' world. Another personal touch in Karl's life came in the form of Jacques de Bascher, a young French aristocrat who Karl fell in love with, which was rare as his friends at the time were constantly pressuring him to get out into the dating world, and he was obstinate, to say the least. But Jacques was different. He was cool and handsome, cultured and smart, but he was also wild, loved to party, and enjoyed acting dangerously, which made Karl nervous for Jacques' safety. Karl lavished Jacques with gifts and even an apartment, and even helped him career-wise by inviting him to work with him at Chloé, by being backstage at shows and helping with the show's music. Karl loved Jacques, and Jacques loved Karl. This was all true. The love was so strong that even a serious test of infidelity couldn't stop the two. In what is probably Jacques' most well-known endeavor, he cheated on Karl with none other than Yves Saint Laurent himself. The affair lasted less than 6 months, but Yves fell hard for Jacques, and their sexual relationship seemed rather uncomfortable for those who have read and heard about it. When word got out that Yves and Jacques were having the affair, it sent shockwaves through Paris, but affected Yves more than it did Jacques. Yves' business partner and lover, Pierre, broke it off with him and threatened Jacques and Karl both, which Karl said was the only issue he really ever had with the whole affair. Karl later said of Berger, quote, "He really stirred up the shit with a group of people who had been really good friends," most likely indicating himself and Yves, and continued, quote, "I was never mad at Yves. There was this famous fling that didn't have anything to do with me." Now, Karl and Yves from the mid-1970s on didn't really have a great relationship. They were always cordial, but it became known that you were either loyal to Saint Laurent or loyal to Lagerfeld, and there were very few who could toe the line of being in both. And if Jacques hadn't died of AIDS in 1984, who knows? They might have been together all of their lives. But their relationship really wasn't affected much by the affair, as they continued on their merry ways until Karl lost Jacques and was incredibly saddened by it. But while Karl's personal life was exploding in so many ways, he was diligently designing more and more. For Chloé, hand-painted silk dresses continued to emerge, and their inspirations ranged from antique blue and white porcelain china to the Viennese Art Nouveau. There were cool culotte pantsuits and flowing halter-neck gowns made of crepe de chine as well. Karl's use of the light and fluttery fabric crepe de chine was smart because it allowed him to keep within his 1930s fashion wheelhouse, while also employing the bias cut techniques he learned from Patou's ateliers. Chloé is where we begin to see the compounding Karl effect, where he picked pieces of aesthetics, design, history, and techniques to create an entirely new creation that hadn't been seen before. Karl took what many would consider old junk and upcycled it into the newest and coolest thing. Essentially, it was Frankenstein's monster in a nice frilly dress. His Chloé ready-to-wear in the 1970s was successful, and it commanded attention. He was the king of pret-a-porter, and what he and Chloé did most definitely mattered, so much so that by the fall 1975 collection, Karl was appointed as the sole designer in charge of Chloé. His first collection was so well received by critics partly because of what the Herald Tribune said was a contribution to fashion on par with Madeleine Vianney, and this contribution was the elimination of unnecessary linings, stiffenings, which might mean boning or wiring, and seams that cluttered up clothing. It was still motif-heavy with flora galore, utilized flowy capelets and sleeves, and had mauves and purples to really hit that romantic aesthetic of Karl's Chloé home. Throughout the rest of the 1970s, Chloé collections continued to excite, with fall 1976 showing painted taffetas, spring 1977 showing tank tops and t-shirts paired over top of dresses, and spring 1978 being the last time in the decade that Karl would showcase the romantic cotton dresses that Gaby Ayon built the foundation of Chloé on. Another important moment I want to discuss is Karl's adding of sneakers to the runway for his spring 1976 collection for Chloé. I'm not sure if he was the first to actually do it, but it was radical regardless. Sneakers would have been associated with working out or kids playing around, not as serious footwear for a luxury ready-to-wear company to design. But the thing about Karl is he was always looking at what would be coming next. And the last item of note when it comes to Chloé in the 1970s is that for his spring 1977 collection, we can see that trellis decor is built into the runway. It's not grandiose, it's not over the top, and we see it in later decades as well, but it's important to note how his legendary show sets started, and it's here. As for Fendi, the early 1970s seems to be rather undocumented from what I could find. There are sketches of Karl's work which are so tiny I thought I was going to reverse my LASIK surgery, but regardless, I have some info to share. In 1970, Karl was still creating geometric motifs in his fur coats. Oftentimes, they were simple stripes that diagonally ran across, while a newer style that depicted a blue sky, white clouds, and a dark tree-lined street emerged as well. Karl, for the rest of his career at Fendi, would paint vivid pictures utilizing fur, and this seems to be the first time it was done. And what a strong and clear outing of this technique it was. According to sketches, 1971 brought a ton of lavish fur stoles that models wrapped around their arms and shoulders in a decadent manner, while 1972 seems to present black and white polka dot furs, which, considering some furs that have color differentiation are seen as defective, must have been a somewhat rebellious idea against that notion. In 1973, we can see a sketch of a pink fur trimmed heel that doesn't say Fendi, but rather Mario Valentino, the shoemaker that Karl was freelance designing for. And it's incredibly intriguing to see that by this time, Karl was already leveraging his multiple design house connections and relationships to create collaborative items for brands. I mean, listen, this beats out the Louis Vuitton and Supreme collaboration by decades. And in that same year, we can see what is apparently the first time the Fendi logo is used on clothing within a Karl-designed garment for Fendi, with the logo sitting on the breast of a jacket. In 1974, a sketch depicts a model wearing a long pink gown and pink banded fur stole. Now, while one can't be certain that this is the first time that fashion and fur materialized in an oddly dyed fur, it is certainly something to behold, as colors like this would have been seen again rather far out for a traditional furrier. For the 1975 collection, there were piecemeal fur striped jackets, astrakhan fur coats with strips of leather that created wide stripes, and a trio of white mink furs, all with tightly belted waists, and the center one with a scalloped hem. By 1977, Fendi began a ready-to-wear collection, meaning it was no longer creating only fur and leather-centric clothes, and the collections seemed to incorporate more tailoring and sportswear looks, some even full of the Fendi name as a print. By the end of the decade, fur flower appliques began to be seen on coats, the mixture of different furs were being experimented with, and fur as whimsical trims were becoming more and more prominent. The final note about Karl's 1970s escapades, though, has to be that writer Michael Roberts would go on to pen that Karl in 1973 was offered a job to become the new designer at Chanel for almost $250,000 then, which means almost $1.5 million today. But he declined the offer, for unexplained reasons. But funnily enough, 10 years later, he would change his tune. The 1980s was the first decade where Karl Lagerfeld reigned as one of the fashion titans of Europe. He kept old jobs, got new ones, and left some behind to pursue a greater career, and it all worked. Now, his work for Fendi was expanding and was getting rather positive reviews throughout the decade. Fall 1980 projected a vision of large, fluffy fur coats with either a textured dress or flared wool skirt underneath, while a leather suit rife with seams in both an Art Deco and fur pelt reminiscent manner was paired with an exaggerated fur bow that again transformed the notion of what fur as a textile should make. And in the same collection, Karl's ability to tame fur to no longer shroud the wearer, but rather flatter their figure through cinched waists or having the pelts line up to contour their body was becoming mastered. And spring 1981 showcased that Fendi's ready-to-wear did not have to encompass fur in the sun, as bathing suits, sundresses, as well as shorts and sandals floated down the catwalk. This was a smart move for both Karl and Fendi, as it gave the brand a new lane to commercialize without having to sacrifice their heritage. The duality of Fendi continued to present itself for the 1982 collection, with light summer dresses for spring and a heavy coat made up of tails for fall, while another was made up of swatches of fur and arranged so that the swatches mirrored Knight's chainmail, which was perfect for winter. In 1983, we saw lots of halter neck styles, some in prints like polka dots, but others were in the Fendi house code of suede, or leather, because suede is leather. And while Karl trialed mixing exotic furs like astrakhan with exotic skins like python, Fendi was moving and grooving. In 1984, Karl expanded on his print work at Fendi by creating graphics by hand painting them first, which he had carried on over from Chloé. And while 85's explosive furs were abundant and fluffy, but had fun accessories like hats, and 1986 saw frou-frou tulle dresses emerge on the runway, which would go on to help define the decade. In 87, Karl's showing of furs was incredibly diverse, and with that diversity, one could see how he had a mastery of the textile, and could command it to encapsulate the wearer like a white coat with black spots that felt felt like a snow princess's wildest dream, or an A-line mink coat whose lines were so crisp and so clean, flowed just so effortlessly that even mink doubters, like myself, would have to appreciate it. The rest of the decade at Fendi didn't show any breakthrough collections, but that doesn't mean they weren't filled with gorgeous styles that would make one want to purchase a Fendi fur. From an astrakhan skirted dress, to poire-like rabbit coats, to a cropped shag fur in black and white. Now Karl's work at Chloé continued on, but once the new decade began, the Chloé flowy and blowy romantic aesthetic was quickly replaced by a much more campy and kitschy one. His spring 1980 collection showcased an array of Lagerfeld signatures that would be synonymous with his work for decades. From tiered flouncy skirts to geometric printed halter neck dresses reminiscent of constructivist Russian styles, they were all there. But the gaudy, oversized pearls as necklaces and belts, as well as rounded star baby toy neck appliques, gave the collection a much more nuanced look at what the decade would become. And I mean, Franco Moschino only started his brand that made fun of fashion in 1983, so this costumey collection from Karl is sort of radical for its time as well. Karl also jettisoned aesthetics from season to season, as one about the 1960s mod culture would be dropped for Anne Boleyn-inspired headpieces, while the following would be referencing Grecian postmodernism. This style to style, season to season became another set-in-stone business practice for Karl. Switch it up season after season and nobody will ever be able to keep up with you. The show's sets also became more and more encompassing of these passing themes, from the giant TV set from fall 1980 to the deserted street that models strode down like fierce sports cars for fall 1983. But Karl's clothing is what kept the critics and customers coming back for more time after time. For his rolled off-the-shoulder dresses were again unique for the time period, and were self-developed by Karl with a fabric manufacturer, while his corsets could be placed over top of dresses and were decorated with sequins or buckles, or even faux draping. And we also begin to see the charming and misleading accessories that would eventually become collector's items for ravenous Chanel customers, like his handbags that resembled then popular transistor or portable radios, inspired by kids in the United States carrying them around, or his piano key handbags or necklaces, or the pair of pliers or wrench necklaces as well. And his finale 2 collections for Chloé, as Karl moved on after the spring 1984 show, showcased an array of comical trompe-l'oeil styles. For fall 1983, water faucets on the front or back of dresses unleashed a cascading rush of silver embroidery that sparkled, shimmered, and shined. And his finale of spring 1984, faux scissors that exposed a fake red sequin lining, while a colorful sequin mini dress on a hanger utilized a black knee-length sheath dress as the backdrop. The most majestic faux Greco-Roman draping was outlined in silver embroidery that was not only a brilliant play on the trompe-l'oeil effect, but also paid homage again to the focus on drapery throughout much of his career. And now you're probably wondering, Luke, but where is the most important Karl Lagerfeld career development of the 1980s? And well, his appointment to Chanel in 1983 is a little bit more intriguing than one might originally think. Now, Karl's contract for Chloé was up in 1983, and in that agreement it was strictly stated that he could not design ready-to-wear for any brand in Paris. But this stipulation precluded the House of Chanel's famous haute couture collections, which meant that when Alain Wertheimer, Chanel's chairman and the grandson of the Chanel Parfums founder Pierre, and his team asked Karl to come on board, he could actually agree. Now, I'll do a quick history of Chanel as respectfully I think we all know most of it. Coco Chanel founded her famous fashion house in 1910, originally as a millinery, and then in just 3 years she began selling accessories and even clothing. By 1915 she was about to open not only a clothing store but a full-fledged haute couture maison, and her sportswear designs as well as utilization of fabrics like jersey that were more affordable for customers led to her becoming a smashing success. And her 2-piece skirt suits changed the way women dressed from the 1910s forward. By the early 1920s she had created a successful jewelry line, and in 1920 specifically she had developed a fragrance, and in 1920 specifically she had a fragrance developed by an expert perfumer, Ernest Beau, and by 1921 she began to sell it. Now the fragrance was revolutionary because of Beau's concoction that was part natural and part synthetic, and as Chanel set off to sell it in the Galerie Lafayette, who was happy to do so, it became clear that she needed to produce it in larger quantities than Beau could produce. And so a meeting was set between Chanel and Pierre Wertheimer, whose family was the owners of Bourjois, a cosmetics company with factories that could in fact handle Chanel's order numbers. The two set up a company called Chanel Parfums in 1924, and things moved on well. In 1926, her little black dress was covered in Vogue, and from there she was a bona fide international fashion star. In September of 1939, Chanel shut down her haute couture operations, as it was becoming clear that World War II was about to begin. Many believe she utilized the war as an excuse to punish her seamstresses who had striked 3 years earlier, but it's not exactly clear what her true intentions of shuttering the maison was. was. She kept her store open at 31 Rue Cambon as a way to not get it taken over by the Nazis who were invading France, but Chanel fled Paris as the German invasion began, and she only returned after May of 1940 when it was completed. She returned to the Ritz Hotel where she had lived previously, and she met with a commendator of the Nazis who were occupying a part of the hotel in order to get a room within it. The Nazi agreed, and she would remain there throughout the war and throughout most of her life. An important detail about Chanel and Nazi Germany is that prior to the German invasion, Chanel had had a relationship with a man named Hans Gunther von Dinklage when they met at some point in St. Moritz. But in 1933 or 1935, von Dinklage was sent to Paris by Nazi Germany for propaganda purposes. But in 1941, at some point, she sought him out as she wanted to help in getting her nephew out of an internment camp, and the same year she also began a relationship with him as well. As time went on during the German occupation of France, what had become commonplace throughout other Nazi-occupied countries began, and it was called dispossession. Now this is important. Essentially, because of the Nazi belief in the inferiority of Jewish people, the Nazis allowed soldiers and locals of the occupied regions to take whatever they felt like from Jewish-owned businesses. Not only was inventory stolen, but Jewish business owners were forced to sell their establishments to non-Jewish people as a way to create poverty and destitution amongst the Jewish population. And so Coco Chanel, who felt that she was swindled out of more profit that she thought she was due, as she only been given 10% of Chanel Parfum's earnings, wanted to change that. Luckily, the Wertheimers smartly moved their assets to a friend and business associate who was not Jewish, so that the Nazis could not gain control of it before they fled to safety in the United States. But this didn't stop Chanel, even though she failed to actually get it during the dispossession era. Her attempted use of dispossession also very much so makes her a terrible, awful human. But this didn't stop Chanel, as in 1946, after the war, she proposed to launch 3 new scents that would rival her most powerful. And the Wertheimers allegedly went to her asking, exactly what does she want? She brokered a deal with the Wertheimers that gave her a much more generous profit and paid for her to return to haute couture. And so in 1954, she got back on the schedule. She brought out her tweed skirt suit and debuted the 2.55 bag, and eventually died in 1971, which left the House of Chanel to only subsist on perfume, ready-to-wear, and bag sales, and was now owned exclusively by the Wertheimers. But by the early 1980s, that was getting stale, and even Alain Wertheimer knew it. In September of 1982, it was announced that Karl would take over as artistic director of Chanel, and while it created excitement, it also created a simmer of discontentment about how Karl wouldn't understand the House of Chanel and how older clients wouldn't appreciate his more modern takes. But Karl was kind of perfectly poised for this position, to be absolutely honest. His ability to design an array of product lines. Another came in his obsession with the 1920s and 1930s aesthetics when Chanel reigned, and his background at Patou meant he had a technical grasp on haute couture and the period that Chanel had truly made her mark on. Karl's idea for his vision of Chanel was, quote, "It's important for young people to touch her style. It must be fun." And while returning to haute couture was difficult due to the slower pace of creation, the Rue Cambon was still abuzz with excitement about his appointment. On January 25th, 1983, he debuted his collection in 31 Rue Cambon, the same place that the Mademoiselle had shown her haute couture collections. The collection opened with 3 models standing in the doorway, one in red, the other in navy, and the other one in the center in cream. Each wore a Chanel skirt suit in the style of the Mademoiselle herself, as Karl didn't want to focus on her boxy tweed sets from the 50s, but rather her swinging 1920s and 1930s skirt suits. Each of the looks nipped in the waist of the jacket, with the skirts falling below the knee and the shoulders being firm but not hard and sharp. Each of the models wore hats paying homage to the millinery side of Chanel and its history, with a white version of the straw hat that Chanel got her start with, the red with a minimal coolie style, and the navy blue took a wool beret approach. Each were adorned with costume jewelry, with the navy blue look being the most heavy-handed in the Chanel manner, and each had 2-tone shoes on, showcasing that Karl understood how to play on each sector of the business. More skirt suits followed, all with white blouses underneath, which not only was Karl familiar with, but also Chanel's earliest suits were worn with them too. The refined tweed sets emerged, either displaying a bright plaid lining and lapels or utilizing the plaid as a softer way of showcasing the garment. Chanel's famous cashmere cardigan skirt sets also arrived in more muted grays and yellows, and Karl's own aesthetics also bled into the collection, like his off-the-shoulder silhouette and his love for prints. While a white wedding dress closed the collection, which was made up of flouncy tiered skirt and jacket like bustier, the most revered look was worn by model Inez de la Fressange, who was put in a black jersey dress with long sleeves and trompe-l'oeil embroidery. Between the dress, the short tulle veil, cropped hair, and the cigarette that Inez puffed on during her walk, she was the spitting image of Chanel herself. And this is what made Karl's career at Chanel so incredibly smart. She was a terrible person. Yes, agree, 100%, without a doubt. But it didn't help the Wertheimer family sell perfumes for her to be Nazi persona non grata. So what had to happen is there had to be a rebrand of her in order for the Jewish-owned family to actually make money off of the perfumes. And that's what Karl did. He turned Coco Chanel into a character, constantly throughout the decades depicting her in different settings and bringing her to life for those who never got to know her. She is central to the story, and getting models that looked like her to wear the clothing that had the Chanel label sewn on it was following what Chanel as her own greatest model did throughout her long-lasting career. The show ended and the applause rang out, and for the most part, the critics were positive. Some were not, and some clients even felt like it wasn't right just yet, but overall, he had done it. By the next season, Karl was over the hump of first show jitters and began to build out his vision of the brand. And it was fun, even the haute couture. The next season was supposedly all about luxury, but seemed to have a Russian twist, which coincided with Chanel's early works with the Russian aristocracy after the fall of the Romanovs. There was of course the tweed skirt suits with all the fixings, but the fur trims and the decadent embroidery reminded one of the court of the Tsar and Tsarina. And once Karl's Chloé contract was up, he could design Chanel's ready-to-wear offerings, which started with spring 1984, which was notably looser and more youthful than the couture. Karl obviously paid homage to the house codes like the Breton striped collar cardigans and drop-waist dresses with pleated skirts, but he also played up the humor and the wit he was known for by adding in a race car style jumpsuit in the classic Chanel cut, while Chanel double C logo helmets paraded down the runway. While these items may have seemed silly, they also helped to expand Chanel into a lifestyle brand that people still to this day love and clamor to buy. For the rest of the 1980s, Karl's ready-to-wear and haute couture were two sides of the same coin, as they both reflected the house codes of the brand, but one was much more traditional and the other a little bit more funky. The ready-to-wear riffed on pop culture and embedded the Chanel ethos into that culture, like in 1985 when Karl miniaturized the Chanel skirt suit, which Chanel herself vehemently opposed to, or when he sent a Madonna lookalike down the runway in '87, or when he placed a long logo t-shirt over a sheer lace skirt in a nouveau version of the 1920s drop waist for spring 1988. And as for haute couture, the culture was also a focal point, but it was a much more refined culture on display, with spring 1985 referencing French painter Watteau, and fall 1987 that touched upon the 17th century opera Atisse, and the rest of the decade had looks inspired by everyone from Shakespeare to Nancy Cunard to Napoleon's Second Empire. If the 1980s was one thing for Karl Lagerfeld, it was his breakout in true stardom. Due to our time constraints, our coverage of the 1990s to the late 2010s of Karl's career is going to be a little bit quick, mostly because I'm a procrastinator and also because, well, Google exists. Karl Chanel was legendary during this period for obvious reasons, mostly because his ready-to-wear collections continued to enthrall and engage new audiences that were looking to discover Chanel, and his Fendi collections did more or less similar endeavors as Chanel, but with heavy fur influences for fall and winter and much lighter and brighter sportswear options for spring and summer. For Fendi in 1991, we saw that the 2010s were still inspiring silhouettes, while newer additions like monogram luggage slung all over a model like a pack mule made the case for logomania, and patched-together fur scraps seemed to help push the grunge aesthetic that would soon take over the decade. And this was all pre-Marc Jacobs at Perry Ellis and Louis Vuitton to boot. Towards the end of the decade, Fendi got sexy, with exposed midriffs being all the rage for 1996, while 1997 gave us beautiful fur coats with very little underneath, and 1999 provided miniskirts and sheer dresses with floor-length fleeces. The return of Karl at Chloé shocked many because it only added to his already exhaustive workload, but his return show for spring 1993 wowed critics. The collection was based on Impressionism with prints flowing forth in either bright pastel hues or graphic motifs, while white dresses capture the 1970s bohemian nature that first made it famous through scalloping, empire necklines, and perforated knits. 1994 saw a resurgence of the famous Chloé blouses from the master himself, as well as his tank top overlays and Grecian-style draped gowns. His humorous trompe-l'oeil embroideries made their way back in the spring 1996 collection, and floral lace overlays emboldened styles for 1997. Karl's official goodbye to Chloé came in the form of the fall 1997 collection, inspired by space, which provided gloriously printed dresses with suns, moons, and stars that were both ethereal but understandable. Now, Chanel was chock full of iconic ready-to-wear runways like the fall 1990 collection exploring the quilted Chanel handbag, but subverting it with elongated clutch versions, or turning the classic flat bag into a hat instead. Spring 1991 took on the beach attire by creating cardigan-inspired leotards, black and white bathing suits, and a blue sequin Chanel jacket paired with wetsuit shorts and a surfboard. Fall 1991 showcased that Karl was still in touch with pop culture by referencing hip-hop culture through creating black quilted leather baseball caps and large gold Chanel chains, obviously inspired by rap culture and black style that was becoming more and more popular around the world. 1991 1993 presented the Chanel logo underwear as pants, 1994 gave us matching tweed bras and mini skirts and the fur version of the Chanel collarless jacket, 1995 saw the classic Chanel 1920 suit cropped and shortened, while 1996 gave us logo mania on terry cloth, all in a fun in the sun manner. But by 1997, Chanel ready-to-wear grew a bit more serious and sullen, with a collection of somber suits with sharp lines and dour fabrics, while 1998 harkened back to Chanel's South of France history, but in a moody pantomime nature, while 1999 finished off this minimal period with black and white focused collections. As for couture, it clung to beautiful techniques and fabrics like decadent lace in 1990, heavy pleating and draping in 1991, and presented the now iconic chain dress that has been recreated since its debut over and over again. The dress's simple and flattering fit with gold chains that draw focus through the bustier, hips, and shoulders was meant to help create a seductive mood for a younger haute couture client who could pay for such luxurious garments. This continuation of courting a younger haute couture customer was seen in 1993 with micro miniskirts on the runway, as grungy plaid was draped across the hips in 1994, and flowy sheer halter-neck gowns apparated in 1995. Throughout the rest of the decade, Karl continued to draw on house codes, exaggerating them with extravagant embroideries, dangerous laces, or dingy tweeds. In 1999, there were rumors that Karl might leave Chanel due to slowing sales and poor reception to recent collections. But he stuck around to lead the brand into the 2000s, and because the president of Chanel at that time said that Karl's contract with Chanel was for life, which would continue on until literally the end of his life. Now, in the new millennium, Karl's career was almost to its peak, but he still had a little bit to go. He had defined Fendi's ethos and spent 27 years concocting an alluring new scent for Chanel, but he wanted to be Kaiser Karl, king, even though he hated the actual nickname Kaiser Karl. Fendi had gained new life with its baguette bag designed by Karl's working partner Silvia Venturini Fendi, but his early 2000s collections felt like they were perfectly poised to carry out the Y2K aesthetic that would most definitely dominate. From the wispy fabrics with curly lettuce hems from 2000, sheer dresses that were barely covered by slinky furs or wool capes for 2001, metallic ensembles and lurex and lace wrapped up in fur coats and capes for 2002, and dresses that looked like they had been adorned with live wiring in 2003, it's clear that the advancement of technology and barely there social dressing norms were present at the brand. Midway through the decade, Fendi entered a more military-inspired aesthetic with furs that resembled uniforms from armies of the past, and it pretty much remained that way until the 2010s. As for Chanel, Karl needed to reinvent himself after a poorly received end-of-the-century show, so he began to once again tap into the house codes, with the year 2000 playing on the famous 2.5 bag quilting on bodices and crop tops. And in that same year, an haute couture collection explored tweeds in electrifying new colors like purple with metallic hems and built-in chartreuse waist belts. Motocross madness hit the runways in 2002, reminiscing on early ready-to-wear collections, while the haute couture counterpart took on Victorian glamour with bustles and high necklines. Early in the 2000s, we begin to see Chanel further push its cruise collections and debut its Métier d'Art collections, which showcase the talents of the Chanel ateliers. The 2004 cruise collection saw clients board an actual cruise ship along the Seine River, while models swished through the cabins, while 2005 saw the red carpet-themed show where models posed for photographers and the audience, and the 2006 cruise collection immersed clients in the busy Grand Central Terminal in New York. Spring 2008 saw Chanel Haute Couture showcase itself in its home for the next decade in Paris's Grand Palais. The spectacle of Karl Lagerfeld's fashion shows might not have started this season, 20 years earlier, but it certainly reached a new height. Guests were greeted with a concrete Chanel collarless jacket that dwarfed the models, and between the intricately pleated dresses and his new version of off-the-shoulder gowns that utilized embroidery on the shoulders and collar, he had truly reached a new height of luxury. Following this, whether it was building a working carousel or a facade of 31 Rue Cambon in the Grand Palais, there was nothing that could stop Karl from creating not only collections that tantalized, but experiences people would do almost anything to see. The 2010s was the last for Karl, and during this time he created some of the most memorable fashion shows ever. He debuted an haute couture line for Fendi, which showcased artisan fur styles with the shows having models walk on water at the Trevi Fountain, and the fall 2010 ready-to-wear Chanel collection saw actual icebergs being transported to the Grand Palais and models wearing fur-woven tweed sets looking ready to brave the harshest of winters. The spring 2012 Chanel haute couture collection saw an airplane cabin tightly squeeze guests together to watch Karl's brilliant take on the 1960s and the golden age of air travel, while Chanel's spring 2013 ready-to-wear collection had models walk down a solar panel runway amongst windmills carrying hula hoop quilted bags. Chanel's spring 2014 ready-to-wear collection granted us the privilege of seeing a supermarket come to life with all Chanel-themed products that were in fact real. And there were handbags that resembled shopping baskets and sneakers embedded with tweed. The piece de resistance was his final collection for Chanel, while he was still alive, which created a real beach with moving waves that models strode across. If there was ever anyone with the will to bring to life people's imagination, it was Karl Lagerfeld. And now, while it's amazing to see all of these fashion shows that will go down in history, Karl was also stirring up controversies outside of the fashion world. He created quite a lot of these controversies with his quotes and comments. The 2010s is when Karl really stood out as a figure that created those masterpieces that we just discussed, but also somebody who turned people against him because of his fat-phobic, misogynistic, racist, and Islamophobic comments. What seemed to be his own insecurity about his weight often caused him to be downright cruel to plus-size women, saying absolutely idiotic things like their eating habits drain the finances of the French social security system, and he even once described Adele as, quote, a little too fat. Now, while Karl did seem to have issues with eating caused by his mother from a young age, and even wrote a diet book, none of it excuses his cruelty here. He often made rude remarks about women, gleefully calling them ugly and that having children was for women and not for men. And in 2018, he said that he was fed up with the Me Too movement. Like he was an asshole. And his racism and misogyny towards people of the Middle East was disgusting as well. He was quoted as saying once, "One cannot, even if there are decades between them, kill millions of Jews so you can bring millions of their worst enemies in their place," in relation to Middle Eastern asylum seekers in Europe and specifically Germany. But this is the problem with Karl on top of all of these horrible acts and things said. He had to be deflecting his own truest insecurities about his life. Whether that was being the son of a card-carrying Nazi, whether it was being a boy who had a poor relationship to food, or being a man that created the image of women for decades but never once tried to understand their actual lives. Yes, Karl was great in so many fashion-centric ways, but as a person, he never seemed to really develop kindness, open-mindedness, and love. And so I question whether there ever really was even, quote, a line of beauty. Not in his tweed suits, his fur jackets, or his pen strokes, but in his heart and his mind. This video doesn't really focus on a lot of what Karl said in his controversies, and it's pretty short in terms of covering that, only because there is a lot of coverage of it that has gone on and that I've read for years at this point, which is great, and it's smart, and it is what needs to happen. But this video is very fashion-centric because very few people really get into the nitty-gritty fashion. So that's why this video is the way that it is. It's not that I'm trying to minimize any of the controversy. It's bad. Now, Karl Lagerfeld died on February 19th, 2019 due to pancreatic cancer at the age of 85 years old. And so that leads us to the end of this video and to the Met Gala and exhibition that will also tell his life story through clothing. It's long and complicated, both beautiful and ugly, but regardless, it needs to be told. So that is the end of this Karl Lagerfeld video. I hope you guys all enjoyed, a lot of time put into it, very excited, about the Met Gala as per usual. I will see you guys in the next one. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and TTY.